Hi, welcome back to the second half of Session 5 of World Revolutions. In this session today, what we're looking at is the preface to the rest of the revolutions we're going to be examining in the course, meaning the modern revolutions, the revolutions of the 20th century, such as the Mexican, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. And what we did in the first part today was to look at some of the basic transformations of modernity. What did modernity mean in terms of the rise of capitalism, its effects on technology, the ability to produce products, urbanization, and also some of the doubts that arose about modernity and whether what was conceived of as modern society was an appropriate future for all of humanity. In the second part of today's session, what we're going to talk about is one particular agent of modernity, if you will, because through the first part of the course and through the first part of today's lecture, I've been talking about the West in general, particularly Western Europe. Those were two of the three revolutions of the early modern age occurred, and specifically the early stages of the rise of capitalism, the age of the Enlightenment, and these ideas. But the transmission of these ideas has not been exclusively the work of European powers, as much as they played a central role in Western expansion and the creation of great imperial systems during the 19th and 20th centuries. But indeed, this society in which we're living, the United States of America, has become, during the 20th century, the principal agent for spreading many of these ideas. Nor were these ideas and practices that America became so central in promoting necessarily the exact same ideas that we see develop in Europe in these earlier centuries. Much of what the United States perceives as a modern society is different in many ways from what existed as a modern society in, let us say, 19th or 18th century Europe. Specifically, Americans have come to concentrate on a few key ideas. In some ways, Americans have become the sort of ultimate modernizers, and our own society has become the most modern of all societies during the 20th century. And it has been the United States that has perhaps had the most profound influence in much of the rest of the world, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, as an agent of change, as an agent of transformation. Indeed, it's not surprising then that Henry Luce, the American publisher in the first half of the 20th century, referred to the 20th century as the American century. We're going to talk about that today because, again, this is an important part of understanding what happens in modern revolutions. When we look at some of these revolutions, such as the Mexican Revolution, for example, the Chinese Revolution, and others, we will see that a number of the modern revolutions, the Iranian Revolution, have a very strong anti-American element in them. Much of what is anti-Americanism has to do with a reaction against the United States when it is perceived as the principal agent of modernization or westernization. In other words, why are people reacting so strongly against the presence of the United States? Well, sometimes it's simply seeing that the United States is a dominant power and reacting against that dominance. But in many instances, what people are reacting against are what they perceive as American values and ideas and how they conflict with the values and principles and beliefs in their own society. Now, Americans have, throughout their history, considered themselves to be a select people. The early immigrants from England, the Pilgrims, many of the Puritans who came, saw the New World, saw this society as the New Jerusalem, as a city upon a hill. In other words, this was to be a new beginning from their perspective in religious terms, that Christianity in the Old World, even after the Reformation, was still corrupt, was still not a proper reflection of what Christianity was supposed to be. And here in the New World, they would create this ideal of Christianity. But very quickly, and certainly no later than the 18th century, that idea of a city upon a hill took upon itself an additional secular meaning. The people who helped lead the American Revolution and helped create the American state and the American nation had exactly the same idea, that what they were creating was something unique in the world, that the political institutions, the social institutions of the old world, of Europe, were inevitably corrupt, And here in North America, in this new society, they could create an ideal of government, an ideal of how human society should function. And embedded in these ideas of a new Jerusalem, whether we're speaking in religious or secular terms, is the idea that we should be spreading these values, these beliefs, these new institutions to the rest of humanity. That it is our obligation to share with the rest of the world the wonderful social, political, and economic system we have created here. Others may not think it's so wonderful, but we do. Other societies look upon ours and say, well, you've gone too far in the creation of a free market system. You don't have enough protection for individual human beings within the economic order, etc. But Americans in general have believed that this is an ideal type of system and one which we should share with the rest of the world. And in the process of doing that, we have brought to many other societies transforming changes. And at the same time, this process has stirred sharp and often deep reactions against those same values and ideas that Americans hold so dear. So it's important to understand what are these ideas, these values, these institutions that constitute American society, that constitute this mission that Americans have been on for 2 centuries now to share these ideas and these values and these institutions with the rest of the world, because only then can we begin to understand what are people reacting against. Why is anti-Americanism often such an important part of revolutionary ideologies in other parts of the world? What exactly are they opposed to? And it isn't the flying of the American flag. It has to do with the values and institutions that are so much a part of our own society. Now, one of the realities of American society is that it was one that experienced a rapid acceleration of capitalism, of capitalist development, certainly from the late 18th century, no later than that, through the 19th and 20th centuries. In many ways, people see this society as the ideal environment for capitalism to develop. In part, because of some of the factors that we talked about when we talked about the first American Revolution, that American society was indeed this land of small family farmers. They were the bulk of human society at that time. Ultimately, these people were moving towards a market economy, and we have, by the early 19th century, the emergence of really commercial, small-scale farming in the United States, where family farmers have become commercial farmers. They both are entrepreneurial in their activities and highly productive, but they also represent an enormous internal consumer market. So in many ways, the United States was spared the whole question of what to do with a peasant society, how to create internal markets for economic development. Conditions existing no later than the late 18th century already created a fairly positive environment for the rise of capitalism in this country. Now, as capitalism takes full hold, as more and more people move away from simply subsistence farming towards commercial farming, and as the great merchants, as we have seen, turn their attention to transforming the internal economy, investing in things like railroads and canals, etc., land speculation, there also developed an ideology promoting American expansionism. One of the critical characteristics of the United States in the first half of the 19th century was the concept of manifest destiny. And what it meant simply was that this society, the United States, initially clinging to the Atlantic shores of the North American continent, was destined to spread across the continent, all the way at least to the Pacific, that this was a destiny that was inevitable. That concept had built in within it that one of the reasons that this destiny was inevitable was because the United States had a civilizing role to play. And in this case, civilizing those populations that lay to the west. That indigenous populations in the western part of North America really were inferior in terms of their social, intellectual, and economic development. And what was needed was the guiding hand of the United States and its modern economic and social system to transform and uplift these groups. That idea, as we have seen, spread all the way to other societies in the West that were already constituted as nation states, particularly and specifically Mexico. The United States eventually warred on Mexico, as we saw, because it believed that indeed, aside from the economic motivations that we saw, that Mexican society was simply inferior. It was not a part of this strong Anglo-Saxon society, culture that had been created in North America. That concept of Anglo-Saxon society was a reflection of the fact that Americans, too, were caught up in the ideas of racism that were so predominant in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. In this case, North Americans, residents of the United States that are, of course, the white population, are seen as part of this sort of cosmic Anglo-Saxon race that is superior to all others. And no, it isn't just Germans or Englishmen, because, of course, American society itself is a mix of various European groups, but rather it is this general group that share this largely indeterminate Anglo-Saxon culture, which is supposedly far superior to any other culture or society around it. So we have, even in the first half of the 19th century, a philosophy building upon this earlier idea of the New Jerusalem that now specifically says, well, Americans are superior. We're superior because we're part of this so-called superior Anglo-Saxon race, and of course, our institutions, our economic, political, and social institutions, are superior to those of Native Americans or Mexicans or anyone else who is not part of that same group. So now we have an even more clearly defined ideology, and one which, in its actual expression, becomes an aggressive form of territorial accumulation. In other words, what is to be the outcome of this manifest destiny? Well, what it means is we're going to go around taking land away from Mexico in particular and spreading our control over what becomes eventually the continental United States of America. So now we have this philosophy, this idea of a New Jerusalem, of this mission the United States is on, at least in the first half of the 19th century, has a very specific territorial expression to it. And we see this in the war against Mexico. By the beginning of the Civil War, as we also saw in our discussion of the Second American Revolution, there has developed a strong alliance that will dominate the United States for the second half of the 19th century between these small commercial farmers and industrialists. These are the two groups that help lead the North in the Civil War, and of course they have compatible interests. Farmers want tools and equipment made by industrialists. They can also sell their food products to industrialists who process them into modern packaged food. So we have both consumers and producers on the part of the small farmers who see the opportunities with the great industrialists. The great industrialists, in return, see both a market for their production of products, such as farm tools and other types of implements, and a source of raw materials for those companies that are involved in food processing. So we have this strong alliance, and again, reinforced by the fact that the huge number of small farmers in North America, in the United States at this time, create a tremendous internal market for the development of a modern industrial base. And the Civil War, well, its impact is debated, certainly marked the time when the United States began to develop a powerful industrial base, when it began to truly transform itself from being a largely agricultural, mercantile society into one which was truly an industrial society. And it was able to do so in much of the 19th century, certainly through the first 3/4 of the 19th century, by building on its own internal market. There was so much to be developed internally in terms of goods that could be sold to people. So much of our own population earned enough income to be consumers that issues that plagued other societies about, well, if we're going to industrialize, where are we going to sell our industrial products, simply weren't an issue in the United States because those products could be sold internally. Another factor that encourages the development of modern industrial capitalism is essentially a protectionist, non-interventionist state. We saw the protectionist part work itself out in the American Civil War. One of the key issues in the war, in the fight over plantations and slavery in the South versus industrialization in the North, was the federal government going to pursue a policy of protectionism on behalf of its own industries? In other words, was it going to raise tariff barriers so that new American industries could flourish and not be overwhelmed by imports from other industrial powers, particularly England? And indeed, that's precisely what happened. In the years after the war, a whole series of import tariffs were raised, protectionist tariffs, to keep out foreign, particularly European goods, and allow American industry to flourish. But at the same time as that is being done, the state is taking a very limited role in the rest of the economy. The American state, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, has largely been non-interventionist, meaning this, that yes, the government collects taxes, builds roads, builds canals, provides basic services, protecting the nation state, etc., but it does not involve itself significantly in the economy itself. It is not anxious to regulate, to create national monopolies of any kind. It leaves the economy's development almost exclusively to the private sector. That, again, has been an enormous opportunity for capitalism to develop within this society, because the state, on the one hand, creates this sort of protective cocoon by excluding imports from other countries that might be cheaper than American products, but at the same time does not do a lot to interfere with the private economy itself, with the free market. This has been almost an ideal combination for the flourishing of capitalism in the society during the 19th and 20th centuries. And anytime you want to compare, let us say, the United States government to Japan or England or France or Germany, you find, even though all of those can be readily described as capitalist economies, nevertheless, this is an economy where the state plays the smallest role in trying to regulate or manage the economy in any significant way. And again, that has led to the flourishing of the private sector. And again, it becomes a model and an ideal that the United States will try to promote in the rest of the world. However, things didn't always go smoothly in this system. Specifically, in the latter part of the 19th century, the American capitalist system found itself in crisis, specifically a crisis of overproduction. As much as the internal market contributed to the great success of the early Industrial Revolution in the United States, the fact is that as we approach the 1870s and then especially the 1880s and 1890s, we find that that industrial system is threatening to destroy itself as a result of its own success. The problem was simply this, that much of the industry in the United States at this time, whether it was heavy industry, meaning things like steel and iron, or whether it was industry aimed towards consumers, processed foods, for example, clothes. Basically, what industry was doing was producing uniform goods, okay? Goods that were not highly distinguishable from each other. A can of dried meat was a can of dried meat. The only way that companies could compete with each other was by lowering prices, by producing more and trying to sell it more cheaply. That fact and the sheer physical capacity of American industry, in other words, its sheer ability to produce goods, was flooding the American market. And what was happening in the last quarter of the 19th century is that a series of crises struck the American economy, a series of depressions, recessions, that were increasingly severe, simply because there were too many goods flooding the internal market. So as much as the internal market was a great boon to the growth of the American economy and the beginnings of industrialization, by the latter part of the 19th century, there was a serious crisis because the economic engine of the industrial plant of this country was running much faster than the consuming side of the economy could possibly do. So the problem was, how do you solve this crisis of overproduction? Part of the answer became by pursuing that mission that the United States saw itself upon in the larger world, and perhaps in slightly refined form. If that mission in the first half of the 19th century was to essentially acquire territories and bring the benefits of American civilization to the western half of the North American continent, the mission was going to be somewhat refined in the second half of the 19th century, as we would look beyond the continental United States to pursue a somewhat similar mission, but now one that had considerable economic overtones. Now, a variety of groups, people become involved in this process. One of them was Secretary of State Seward. Seward was Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. Seward's idea was to acquire Alaska from Russia, a policy for which he was heavily criticized at the time. But the importance of Seward and this acquisition was that Seward realized the limits of America's internal possibilities, the limits of the continental United States, and was looking to reach beyond the continental United States to expand American influence and control into larger areas of the globe. And he and subsequent secretaries of state would pursue a similar kind of policy. What the United States has to do is reach out into the larger world in order to secure its interests, in order to spread the benefits of its own society. There were practical military aspects of this same mission. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan was one of the chief advocates of a powerful Navy, that what the United States had to do was create a Navy that could be powerful in both the Atlantic and Pacific. It had to assure itself of coaling stations and a Navy of the size in terms of the number and size of its ships, which could be an influence in both of these great oceans. Mahan's military concepts play an important role in the larger issue here, which was exactly what kind of influence was the United States going to exercise in the world at large. We'll come back to that in just a moment. A third aspect of this sort of expansionary effort, the late 19th century, were missionaries. Christian missionaries had long been active in the United States, but focused mostly on this country itself, on the frontier as it moved westward, converting Native Americans, trying to bring religion and civilization to frontier communities as people moved westward. But now, in the late 19th century, missionaries were looking beyond the borders of this country again towards places like China. China became a particularly major focus of Christian missionaries from the United States in the late 19th century. That Christian missionaries would go there from this country and convert the millions of Chinese and bring them into Christianity, something that actually Christian missionaries have been trying to do for more than 300 years in China. But here we have three different forces. We have secretaries of state, we have these naval interests, and we have missionary groups, all of them interested in expanding American influence in the world at large. Again, they may well have different agendas. Seward is thinking about the overall power of the United States. Mahan is concerned about naval influence, and the missionaries are concerned about spreading Christianity. But they all believe that this country has a larger mission that extends beyond the borders of the continental United States, all seeking to create the new American empire. And what would that new empire be? Well, it was clear that it was not going to follow the European model. Americans were not going to create that kind of territorial colonialism that had been typical of Europe, indeed was typical of Europe precisely at this time. This is precisely the time when Europeans are scrambling for Africa, to seize control of all of Africa, extending their influence in the Middle East and in China, and creating a series of colonies. The United States will refuse to pursue that goal, to the extent that the United States will acquire territories outside of the continental United States. They are few and far between. They are mostly seen as contributing to this idea of mayhem, of having a powerful navy. You need coaling stations. You need places where the ships can stop. These would be a few strategic outposts. What the United States is really interested in doing is creating an economic empire, one in which its goods will be predominant, where it will be able to sell its goods around the globe and sell them effectively. It itself has been a victim of exclusion of other colonial systems. Americans have a hard time selling goods in much of the rest of the world that is controlled by European colonies. They don't want to go down that road. They don't want to replicate that process. The United States is well aware of the costs of creating a land-based empire. They wish to avoid that. And in so doing, what they fix upon is the idea instead of opening up the world's markets to American products. Whether it's Latin America, Asia, these areas will become critical targets in the decades that follow. And of course, what this will do is alleviate the problem of surplus production in the economy. At least it's believed that it will alleviate that problem. It will allow the United States to sell more of its own products, products that its own domestic economy could not absorb by selling them overseas. But it's important to remember that this new mission, as much as it focuses on the creation of a commercial empire, still has a variety of facets to it. Americans still see their own political, cultural systems as superior to those of any other part of the world. So this mission will always have these elements in it as well. In other words, it isn't just strictly, well, we want to go out and sell, dry goods to the rest of the world. We also want to sell our political system, our religious beliefs, our social structures. All of this becomes part of the package and will become increasingly so during the 20th century. So we see the United States on this mission in the late 19th century already. It has a very powerful economic motive to it, but there are also other issues at stake here. Americans see this as part of this historic mission that the United States has to share the accomplishments of its own society with the rest of the world. Now, another factor that will influence what happens in the decades that follow is the rise of the Second Industrial Revolution. This is the revolution that Marx anticipated and that Marx felt would lead inevitably to communism, and that is the rise of the machine. In the late 19th century, science-based industries begin to emerge. In other words, industries that are built specifically on scientific breakthroughs, such as the electric industry, the chemical industry, industries that are powered specifically by new scientific discoveries. These are industries that begin to build new factory systems with new technologies, far more efficient than anything that might have been imagined in the first half of the 19th century. Just the application, for example, of electricity alone to industrial production has a phenomenal impact. Electricity can be applied in so many different ways. If you think back to the primitive idea of a watermill, it turns one axle and then you can add machines to it, but you have to stick close to that one axle that's being turned by the watermill. Well, steam power is about the same way. With electricity, you can put power sources all over a factory. You can become far more efficient in that way. This is truly the age that Chaplin was worried about in modern times. He was reflecting the reality of what was going on in the world as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. This is the time of the application of machine manufacturing to every aspect of the industrial process. It is the rise of the modern corporation. where not only the factory floor becomes more efficient, but corporations themselves. They no longer will be mom and pop or family enterprises. Now we will have modern, specialized corporate bureaucracies with accountants, the marketing people, managers. All of these groups set off production operators, highly specialized corporate structures. This system of production makes the United States the most powerful industrial force in the world by the early 20th century. It's not that other societies weren't headed down the same path. It's just that no other society in the world was moving as rapidly into the second industrial revolution as was the United States. And again, part thanks to an ever-expanding internal market, thanks to a state system that was willing to allow many of these changes to go on without interference from the political process itself. The United States moved far more rapidly into the second industrial revolution than any other society in the world. It became, as a result, the first truly modern industrial society, the first one to fully embrace the second industrial revolution and the capabilities of this new technology, this new machinery. As we see here, by the 1920s, 42% of the world's industrial goods were being produced in this country. And when you think, well, gee, you've got the United States, you've got England, Germany, Holland, France, Japan, all as significant industrial producers in the world. But the other five combined are accounting for a little over 50%. One country is accounting for over 40% of the world's industrial production. Just a small sign of how far and how rapidly the United States had grown as an industrial power. Now, this new technology inevitably has human implications. Can't just invent new technology and say, okay, well, we're just going to use the new machinery. There were also radical reorganizations of how people worked. Henry Ford, the inventor of what people now call Fordism, what we think of as the assembly line. Ford's idea was to take these new technologies and apply them in such a way as to achieve continuous process manufacturing. In other words, constantly moving a product down a line as each new step was taken in its manufacture, and to do this on a continuous flow basis. This meant enormous efforts at securing sufficient supplies of goods, management of individuals, and it created precisely the kind of workshop environment that people were so concerned about in the 20th century, and that is a system in which people have been reduced to little more than cogs in a machine, where indeed that's what your function is to do one minor function. Furthermore, another innovator named Taylor invented, well, I shouldn't say invented, but became the leading applicant of what are known as time motion studies. And that's what Taylorism is. What time motion studies are an effort to take an individual in a work process and study each and every one of their motions to try to determine the maximum efficient method by which that person can do their job. In other words, they may watch a machine tool operator and see that he makes 15 motions in cutting a widget, a metal device. They then study those, engineers study those patterns of operation and come up with a way that he can take just 9 motions to produce the same piece of equipment. In essence, what they are doing is they are taking people and treating them, analyzing them like they were a machine. Okay? What's the most efficient method we can use to get the maximum amount of work out of you? It isn't just that we put the new machine in front of you and that it's powered by electricity. No, we actually have to make you operate just as efficiently as the machine does. And we literally study every motion that you make and then tell you, okay, this is how you have to do it in the future. Up until this time, as much as there had been modern, or there had been industrialization and factory systems in existence for well over 150 years, nevertheless, workers had a great deal of leeway on how they did their jobs. People did not stand over them and tell them exactly how to do their job, how to make a machine work. Most of these people had significant leeway on how they did their job. In fact, oftentimes workers cooperated on the factory floor in determining how they would produce a product. But all of that is being swept away now in this new age. The machines are taking over in part, and what is left to human beings is being analyzed by engineers to see that they operate like machines. So we have increasing control from top down in the industrial process. Never before in the production of material goods in a workplace has there been such complete control, where engineers come in and analyze every step of the productive process, and workers are expected to operate in almost a machine-like fashion in order to function within this new system. This was, not surprisingly, a source of considerable rebellion within the American workplace. It wasn't just expressed in things like Chaplin's Modern Times. There were massive strikes as workers rebelled against this process, as they rebelled against what they saw as a dehumanization of the workplace, that they would now be subject to these very strict rules on exactly how they did their job. Every minute was going to be counted, much like people today working on computers when they discover that, gee, your every keystroke is being recorded so that your manager can come by later and say, well, gee, you really weren't working that hard today. You only did 150 keystrokes in the first 2 minutes. Or I see that you only took, 15 phone calls here at our central reservation site. We've got it recorded and exactly how many minutes you took with each person. That kind of minute control came into the workplace in the industrial sector in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and was a source of considerable rebellion. In some ways, it was exactly what Marx had been talking about, that as the machines took over, as more and more of this technology was put in place, it would create a great opportunity. But under the existing system, it was actually going to dehumanize people because they would become more and more specialized, less and less opportunity to have a creative input into the process. So what was to be done? How was this problem to be dealt with? And remember, they'd already had one crisis of overproduction. Even before the coming of the Second Industrial Revolution, if they're more efficient than ever, how are they going to deal with even greater production made possible by these new systems, these new technologies? Well, that helps lead us to the next aspect of American society and its mission, and that is looking at some of the values and practices that have emerged in modern American society. And one of them, specifically in response to these problems of oversupply and of worker unrest, was consumerism. One of the truly distinctive features of American society, even when we compare it to other Western societies, other capitalist societies, is the degree to which America became, even in the early 20th century, a consumer society. Now, when you say this to people and say, well, it's a really distinctive feature of American society, they will say, I don't know what you're talking about because, people always consume things. People have been selling things and buying things and using them, back to ancient times. That's very true. The distinctive feature of consumerism, as we define it in the modern era, is the idea that people are being taught, being trained, being educated, being influenced to believe that the ultimate happiness of human beings lies in the consumption of material goods and services. In other words, this is not simply a social value that says, well, gee, you need to buy things to take care of yourself. You need food, so you're going to have to buy some. All right? That makes sense. This is a system that says, look, if you want true happiness, the ultimate happiness of human beings comes through this process of consumption. And all you have to do is look around American society at this time in history, and we see it to the extreme degree, even though it was prevalent by the 1920s and 30s. And that is advertising. Advertising whose message is the consumption of this product will bring you happiness as a human being. This is the message that you are bombarded with on a daily basis in this society. It's not just that, look, this automobile is better than that automobile over here. Or if you don't have an automobile, you won't be able to get to work on time or efficiently. This will improve your efficiency. You'll get there faster. No. You're buying this car because it'll make you happy. Okay? This vehicle, you can get in your SUV now and you can pack the children and the dog and everybody will smile and be happy. And they can watch, your kids can watch a video in the back of the vehicle and they'll be happy. You can buy a house. When you get to that house, you won't be worried about the mortgage, right? You'll all be smiling and happy because you've provided for your family. You will have done the right thing and your children will be happy, your spouse will be happy. Everyone will benefit from this. If you drink beer, it'll make you happy. In fact, apparently it'll make you attractive because people who drink beer, at least in a lot of these commercials, the beach commercials, are all slim and attractive and, looking young. Nobody has a beer belly. Nobody's suffering from acute alcoholism. They're very happy. And that is the message of consumerism. In very simple terms, in advertising, but the fact is, it is a message that pervades American society, that this is where we want to go as a society. This is what we want to achieve because this is what brings human happiness. So on a practical level, it helps deal with the problem of oversupply of products that becomes an issue even more so with the Second Industrial Revolution because you can get more people to buy more goods. More and more in American society in the 20th century, people will put aside self-sustaining methods of acquiring goods and services and turn towards commercially produced goods and services. For example, soap. Even in the 19th century, most people were still making their own soap. By the 20th century, you don't make your own soap, you buy soap. Your clothes, you don't make your own clothes anymore, you buy clothes. So more and more of the material world around you will not be things that you make or barter for. It'll be products that you buy. And services the same way. By the late 20th century, it was not a matter of, well, gee, if you're feeling depressed, why don't you go talk to your local clergyman or maybe your Aunt Sue, somebody who has good advice. Now you go to a psychiatrist or a therapist. They charge you $150 an hour. If only your aunt was able to charge that. So it's a service that you buy. If you want to be a better person, you take classes that you pay for, that teach you how to be pleasant, how to interact with other human beings. So you reshape yourself, but you do it by buying services. So that almost every aspect of your life is something that you're going to have to buy. Today, if you want to buy a child, you can even shape the child. Because they'll put you into a fertility clinic and they can tell you, well, gee, we can get you a kid that's, will turn out to be 6'2" and blonde and, with an IQ of 150. So you can, buy your children now. That's literally what you're doing in the end because you're paying for that service. So more and more of the economy and society becomes commercialized so that indeed we can try to deal with this problem of oversupply within the economic system. In addition, this was designed in part to deal with unhappiness in the modern workplace, as people found themselves in systems that were highly specialized, highly routinized. In other words, what can you hope for as a factory worker after days of drudgery, where you're in there doing the same thing over and over again? Well, now we have a consumer society. You can go out and buy that little bungalow. You can have a little two-bedroom house that you want. You can have your own car. You can buy a boat. You can have those material goods so that even if work is boring and dull in this highly specialized environment, that's okay. You can seek release from it. You'll have a television. You can go watch television at the end of the day and enjoy yourself, pass the time, so your work situation is not nearly as frustrating. In some ways, that's why Marx proved to be wrong, because he didn't foresee, look, there's an alternative to revolution. It's called consumerism. You can get people to calm down, to be less reactive to the new workplace by offering them material incentives, the material incentives of a consumer society. But it's always important to remember it goes beyond just the idea of acquiring material goods, but the basic belief that these goods will bring human happiness. This is really what lies at the heart of consumerism. Connected directly to that value is the idea of materialism. Materialism is simply saying, look at what is important in the world are material things, not just in the sense of that you can consume them personally, but how do we measure the world around us? How do we measure who's the best? Well, this baseball player is making $30 million a year. He's the best because he's acquired a huge amount of material goods. He has that capacity. If we want to know which society is best, well, which society can produce the most, whatever, computers, televisions, the most miles of paved highway, that's how we measure. That's our measuring stick in modern society, certainly in modern American society, is that you measure it according to material accomplishment. Whether you're talking about an individual, you're talking about an entire society, it's what is the level of material accomplishment. That tells us, and that's how we measure people. You know, it's the sort of old American rule, bigger is better. Well, the more material production, the more material accomplishments you can demonstrate, the more valued you will be. Competitiveness. Again, this is something that is distinctive in American society, not that it is unique, not that no one else in the world is competitive, but in no other society up until the end of the 20th century had such an emphasis been put on competitiveness, that this is the social activity that most contributes to the well-being of humanity as a whole. That when we go out and become competitive, we make ourselves better, we make the people around us better, we make for a better world. Almost every activity in American society, school activity, sports activity, is designed to enhance people's competitive spirits. As much as we talk about, oh, well, it's a team effort, sure. That's something you say, well, the television cameras are on. But in the reality of whether it's school or athletic competition, the idea is which individual is going to excel, which individual is going to exceed his or her competitors in achieving the best, achieving the most. And this is seen as a very positive accomplishment in American society. This is how things get done. This is how the economy grows. This is how we improve things. I mean, the free market is based on the same idea that if you've got a problem, simply open it up to competition and let competitors, people competing for your business, they'll come up with the best solution for you. The justification for privatization of government activities, the same idea. Only when you have that competitive spirit and that competitive process going on will you get the best operation, will you get the best ideas. It will all come out of this competitive spirit. So again, no other society puts this degree of emphasis on competition, as does American society. It is, like consumerism, one of the true hallmarks of American culture in the 20th century. Again, closely related to that, as materialism is to consumerism, is individualism, the importance of the individual. And here, we've already seen in the first three revolutions the significance of the individual in Western societies. I mean, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, etc. The increasing belief that it is the individual who is the critical element of society. That individuals, on the one hand, have certain rights, their rights as a citizen, the right to vote, the right to free assembly, and at the same time is due as much in the way of investment of society's resources as is possible. In other words, society should put its focus on bettering the individual. That what we really want to do is not say, oh, well, we want a better community as a whole. Well, that's a fine ideal. But what we really want to do is improve the individual. And again, when you look at our society, whether it's at the governmental level or the individual level, it is the individual who is the focus of whatever activity we pursue. In other words, when you get an education, the truth is, in this society, as much as people say, well, I want to take my education and go out and do good for society. Yes. But the vast majority of Americans say, look, I want to get a good education so I can get a good job, so I can be better at what I'm doing, so I can make more money, so I can do this, I can do that. Decision-making is focused on the individual. Here in this society, far more than others, and again, it's relative. It's not that individualism doesn't exist anywhere, but here. But in this society in particular, people are quite comfortable with the idea that when they make a decision about their career, for example, that decision should reflect their individual interests. The idea that it should reflect the interests of their family is really of a secondary concern in most cases. I'm not saying it's never the primary concern. But family considerations, in most American families, if a son or daughter says, well, I really want to be a veterinarian, and the parents say, well, we'd rather have you be a ballerina, the child will probably wind up in veterinary school, because most American parents aren't going to say, well, you got to go be this, versus that. And children will feel far more comfortable ultimately as they reach adulthood in defying, their parents who might have tried to push them in a certain direction than they would in other societies. Because again, the focus in our society is the individual, the rights of the individual, the improvement of the individual. In many ways, it has a very positive aspect to it, because we devote so much time and energy to improving the individual and to believing that individual human beings are almost infinitely perfectible, that we can always do better. If we take a course, if we get some exercise, American preoccupation with exercise and being in good health, that we can have the perfect body, we can have the perfect mind, we can do each of these things because human beings are essentially perfectible, and our focus is on that perfectible individual. Of course, remember, on the other side of it, for many people, this comes across as selfishness. In other societies, and as we will see this to be true, in many societies, this extreme focus on the individual is seen as acutely selfish. I mean, why would you not take into consideration, your family's concerns about what your education is going to be, what kind of career you're going to pursue? In fact, those should be primary in your mind rather than secondary. So it has its positive aspects, but as we will see, it can also be viewed very negatively depending upon the cultural context. Another factor, which, like individualism, we see a tradition of in the West, is the idea of progress. The Enlightenment itself placed this idea at the center of Western culture, the idea that human society as a whole is on a journey which is a journey upward for humanity, meaning the world will get steadily better. Not maybe in a perfectly uniform process, but if we measure human societies over time, we will find that they are getting better and that we can make them better. That the world we have today is a better world than we had 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago. And that the world that will exist 100, 200, and 500 years hence will be better than the one that we have now. That there is this improvability in human societies as a whole. This is a fundamental tenet of Western societies, but particularly strong in American society. Progress. That we are making progress. That we are moving ahead, making the world better. Because otherwise, how do we justify all of these things that we're doing? The Industrial Revolution, the development of this massive federal government that we have, etc. All of this is built with the justification that we are making the world a better place. We are the ultimate expression of the Enlightenment thinkers in that regard. Here again, when we come to other societies, it will be important to remember that in other societies, that concept is not necessarily as strong as it is in American society. And in fact, some people have questioned, even in Western societies, whether progress is in fact a rational concept. Because the question becomes, how do you measure progress? I mean, why is our society better today than 500 years ago? In the first half today, we were talking about some questions about modernity, and one of the areas that gets questioned when you see things like the First World War and the influenza epidemic is this idea of progress. Is that really progress? Is the invention of the nuclear weaponry of the 20th century progress? The fact that we could destroy all of humanity in a matter of a few hours? So this idea of progress, as powerful as it is, and as important as it is, and as much as it justifies, well, for example, why are we, in this mad race in terms of computers? That everyone is going to have a computer on their desk, everyone is going to be computer literate, aside from the fact that a lot of people make money doing that, because it's progress. The world will be better when everyone has a computer than it was when no one had a computer. As powerful as that is, many people have come to question that idea both in the West and elsewhere. Is this because this is the ultimate justification of modernity, that we are making things better and better. But as we've seen in the first half, there have been events in the first half of the 20th century in particular which raised questions about whether, in fact, this headlong progress that we're making is the ideal course to pursue for all of humanity. Again, this is a question that comes up and lies at the heart of some of the revolutionary initiatives that we're going to see later on. Next, the cult of the new, meaning, and again, like some of these early ones, it's connected to a preceding factor, progress. In this case, that new is better. You know, what is progress? Excuse me. Well, anything that's new is seen as progressive and better. Again, take American advertising as the simple expression of this. If you want to, you've got a product you've had out there for 10 years and sales are lagging. What do companies often do? They put a sign on the box that now says the new, product X or Y. I don't think I should be advertising. It's the new soap powder. Okay, it's the same soap powder. They just put a sign on it that said it was new, and people will buy it with the belief that, well, if it's new, then it's got to be improved. This belief that what is best is what we have just created is, again, fundamental to American society. Now, again, this might seem like a relatively harmless concept, but what it also suggests is that what is old is not so good. And what is old may not be just an old box of soap powder. It may be the way people relate to each other, family relationships, community, how people choose to do their work, how people interact with each other. There is a tendency in our society to dismiss anything that we label as traditional. This is the traditional, pattern of behavior. This is the way we used to do things. And the belief that anything that is honored by time is not nearly as good as something that has been recently created. Why, for example, would you want to go home and make your own dinner and sit with your family when you can go out to McDonald's? Sit there with your family and throw greasy wrappers at each other. Because it's new, okay? The old way, sitting at home, and sitting at the dinner table, that's not fun. You go to McDonald's, that's new, that's better. It suggests that things that are honored by time and tradition are inferior to something that has been newly created and invented. All of these factors become part of the American mission. As much as the American mission continues to have a strong material and economic aspect to it, in other words, American business wanting to go overseas and invest and sell, etc., it is also true that the American mission includes these values and practices that are so typical of American society. And what Americans bring to the rest of the world in the 20th century is not just, well, here's the technology and here's some investment from us. They want to do the whole 9 yards. They want to change your workplace and how you work. They want to change your values because they want you to be consumers. They want you to be materialistic. They want you to focus on the individual. And as much as we prize these values in our own society, they're not always as highly prized elsewhere. And some of the revolutionary movements that we're going to be looking at are direct reactions to this process of change that the Americans in particular bring. And it's not to say that other Western societies weren't promoting some of these changes as well, but none so radically and so aggressively as American society in the 20th century. Now, this new, modern, better system that the Americans had created by the early 20th century proved to have problems, just as the earlier Industrial Revolution in America had problems, specifically the Great Depression. Here was this massive collapse of the world economy. And no economy suffered a greater collapse than this economy, in part precisely because it had already gone so far in creating a consumer-based economy. When things started to go bad, when credit became tight, when people started to lose jobs, Millions of people who were making payments on a house, a car, a refrigerator, etc., stopped making those payments because they had to eat. And it would be a very long time before they were going to go out and make that kind of investment again. Now, for a corporation, okay, things get bad, we close down the plant for a while, we wait until things look a little bit better, and then we go out and get a bank loan or use the resources we have, we start up again. But for an individual who loses their home, their car, etc., it's going to be a long time before you feel secure enough to go out and do that again. So by the very fact it was a consumer economy, this economy was affected far worse than most others in the world as a result of the Great Depression. To try to lift the United States out of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, beginning in 1932, took a series of initiatives to try to solve this crisis, which many people believed was going to destroy this economy because this economy was the prime example of the modern capitalist economy. Many people believe that that modern capitalist system was about to be destroyed by the Great Depression. Essentially, what Roosevelt did was he tried to use state powers as much as possible, the government, to prime the economic pump, put money into the economy, start public works projects and get people working again, provide a backup system for the private banking network so it could function again, promote the growth of international trade again with trade agreements. The U.S. government taking on a much more active role than it had ever had in the past in the economy to try to get it started again. However, to do so was going to take an enormous effort that had to be backed by substantial sectors of American society. To make this effort work, the United States was going to have to be able to get the international economy going again, and was also going to have to be able to assure producers of industrial peace that after the havoc that had been wreaked by the Great Depression, that workers would not rise up and destroy this system that Roosevelt and others were trying so desperately to rebuild. Now, not all industrialists in the United States were in support of Roosevelt's ideas, either the idea of labor peace or the idea of building the international economy. More traditional industrialists, people in steel plants, etc., were concerned both because they feared international competition if the international economy was reawakened, and because they were labor-intensive industries. They saw a very high price would have to be paid for labor peace. Roosevelt's allies in his effort included people like the Rockefellers. The Rockefeller family was in a high-tech industry. That's what oil production really was, oil refining. And it was an industry in which the United States was highly competitive internationally. Interests like the Rockefellers, the General Electric Company, and others came to Roosevelt's assistance to forge an economic system which over the next 50 years would make the United States the dominant economic power across the world. It was a system which emphasized opening up the economy of the world, globalization. Yeah, Roosevelt thought of it long before Clinton or anybody else. Based on the highly competitive advantages which America's most advanced industries enjoyed, things like the electric industry, the chemical industry, the petrochemical industry, etc. And secondly, pursued a compromise with labor, assuring labor unions that they would receive substantial material rewards as long as they abandoned radical policies, as long as the labor unions did not seek to take control of the factories, did not disrupt the productive process in a significant way. Industry would provide significant improvements in their wages, in their working conditions over the years. So we have, in essence, an alliance of three groups: the federal government, the high-tech industries of that age, and labor unions to pursue an aggressive international policy to spread American influence around the globe. This new age is based on corporate welfare and social peace, to seek a new international order in which the United States would truly dominate the world economy. Now, in the years since then, other elements have been added to this effort. Private foundations, like the Rockefeller and Ford foundations, that have gone out into the world seeking to influence the development of social policies in much of the rest of the world. Educational systems, the Ford Foundation has been extremely influential in shaping universities, schools of higher education in places like Latin America, Africa, and Asia, as has the Rockefeller Foundation, influencing these parts of the world, helping to train the leaders of the 20th century in the non-Western world, seeing to it that many of them were educated in the United States and exposed to American ideas. The American missionary movement continued to play a role, although foundations were far more influential in that regard. In addition, the U.S. government added a series of alliances and organizations to help promote this same process of internationalization. Alliances like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so the United States would have a major role in Europe. The United States Agency for International Development. USAID is the foreign aid agency of the U.S. government. Aid is not given simply as a goodwill gesture. When aid is given, aid is in the form of American products, and it is given with the understanding that countries that accept it will help shape systems, their own economic and social systems, that are similar to, compatible with, those of the United States. The United States Information Agency, USIA, to spread American ideas through radio, television, advertising, movies, and occasionally the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, covert operations to deal with countries that reject these overtures, whether it's from foreign aid or the U.S. Information Agency, foreign investment. Those who reject this mission can be subject to the activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. And on a larger scale, institutions that the United States helped create, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Agencies that are helping to shape an economy globally, which is dominated by private enterprise and which is open to U.S. investment and trade. Both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have worked in that direction for decades. And American business itself, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, has moved beyond just trade and beyond just investing in things like petroleum extraction into manufacturing, so that American companies now appear across the globe, manufacturing sneakers, computers, televisions, Coca-Cola, across the globe. So it isn't just a matter of trading with other countries or extracting raw materials anymore. Now it's a matter of actually setting up plants across the globe, so that American multinationals appear in societies around the world. So we see this incredibly successful mission, particularly from the time of the Great Depression on, as the United States government, private enterprise, and private foundations have worked hand in glove to spread American influence and the presence of American ideas and American business around the globe. Now, with all of these ideas, the fact is, as I've suggested earlier, not all of them, as much as we prize them, are necessarily accepted with the same enthusiasm that we tend to share them with the world. The United States has strongly promoted internationalism, the idea that the world around us should be open to American ideas and American investment. But of course, many other societies reject that idea. Just as in the 19th century, the United States wanted to keep its economy protected from the outside, Many societies today have tried to protect their economy and many of their ideas and want to reject this growing exposure to the international economy and the culture that the United States has sought to share with the rest of the globe. As a basic idea within the American mission, we promote the idea of change. Change is good. Change brings progress, and progress is good. You have to have progress. The idea of the new, that the new is always better than the old. Here again, in many societies, tradition, things that are historically sanctioned, are valued. And valued often more than things that are new and different. Frequently, people who are elderly are valued because they are old, because they have wisdom gained over the years. We don't value age. We take old people and put them in homes, preferably away from our own home. If you're a manager in a corporation and you're getting older, it's a good chance you're not going to be there much longer because the new, the young, are preferred. This clashes with the values in many other societies. The individual versus community. Again, our enormous emphasis upon the individual versus the family and the community. Not that we don't value family and community, but what do we hold nearest and dearest is the individual's rights, the individual's opportunities for development. It's not that other societies don't believe in individualism, but they also see and often place ahead of it the values of the community, of the family. In Japan, you have a society which is a capitalist society, but its views of the individual versus the community versus the family are very different from our own. And these differences have often led to clashes in other societies when other societies believe that these values that are so typified by American culture are being imposed upon them and threaten to undermine the values that they hold dearest. Competition versus cooperation. Again, it is not that other societies do not have competitive elements to their cultures. They absolutely do. But in other societies, cooperation is often as highly valued as is competitiveness. That competitiveness is often seen as destructive because if one's only goal is to come out ahead, to beat the opposition, to outdo them, then the larger mission or goal may be lost. Again, using the example of Japanese society, because you can say, look, it as our own, is a modern society, is a capitalist society. But there, too, the stress has often been put on cooperation because of this belief that acute degrees of competitiveness will lead to people losing sight of what it is exactly they're trying to accomplish. Rather than trying to say, look, this is our ultimate goal, we want to work towards that goal, we're saying, well, how can I gain an advantage for today? How can I make my part of the business look better than anybody else's, rather than saying, what's the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve here? Consumerism versus subsistence. Again, in many societies, the idea that the critical focus of society as a whole should be nothing other than the consumption of material goods clashes with their values. Even in our own society, there are significant criticisms of this. Religious leaders have often criticized the, acute emphasis on consumerism. You see that at, holidays like Christmas, when religious leaders and others will often criticize that. But the fact is, it remains, in fact, a predominant value in American society. Elsewhere, this is seen as really a corrupting influence, that rather than focusing on more spiritual values, on ethical issues, on moral issues, that we become focused instead on the accumulation of material goods. And in many societies, it is believed that, particularly in peasant societies, that there should always be a degree of balance, that rather than society focusing strictly on how much can each individual consume, we should focus instead on to what degree is there some element of equity, where there is not extremes, or there are not extremes between the very rich and the very poor. And materialism and secularism versus spiritualism and aestheticism, meaning this, that with our emphasis on the material, we tend to focus on the here and now. That is not to say that Americans aren't spiritual and religious, but religion is seen as an individual, private affair. That what I believe in terms of my religious beliefs, whether I have any or not, is my business. And my values, my moral code, etc., something that I essentially share with myself and maybe friends and people in a church somewhere. But it does not become something that dominates public affairs and public discussion. Rather, in this society, it is a secular society. We worry about the here and now. Government deals with, and public debates predominantly deal with the issues of the here and now. But in other societies, such as Islamic societies, religion is believed to play a central role in defining social values, moral values. And the idea that those would take second place to material concerns and secular concerns is considered an anathema. So here again, we run into a situation where American values conflict with the values of other societies. This is going to be important, as is this whole question of modernization. We are going to see in the revolutions of the 20th century that many of them are focused on whether indeed they want to pursue a course of modernization and under what conditions. And furthermore, to what extent do they want to accept the values typified by American society as the ultimate expression of modernity. That concern is best expressed by Walter Benjamin, a philosopher and critic of the 20th century, who referred to modernity as a great train rushing forward. And he says, perhaps revolutions are the reaching of humanity traveling in this train for the emergency brake. In other words, if modernity is this train rushing forward, maybe a lot of humanity doesn't want to be on that train or doesn't want to go at that speed. Maybe they are rejecting much of what is the modern world, much of what is westernization and modernization. And this will be an important issue for us to consider throughout the modern revolutions. To what extent are they accepting, rejecting, or modifying the whole process of modernization in the 20th century? And we'll begin looking at one of those revolutions next week.